In this episode, Officer Anthony Frongillo will walk you through the history of SWAT and how the regional Metro-LEC SWAT operates. Officer Joe Brienze will elaborate on the crisis negotiation team.
Hello everyone, I am Anthony Frongillo. I am a doctoral candidate. I am writing my dissertation on SWAT, really understanding why and how SWAT teams developed and then how they became regionalized like ours is. So, my dad always taught me that if you're going to understand something, you have to start at the definition, and to start at the definition, you have to start at the beginning. So I really kind of want to talk about when, where, and why SWAT started in this country and what it is. I'm going to go to the first slide. So our first slide really talks about what was happening in this country in the 1960s. And it was an incredibly tumultuous time. We always saw the Vietnam War began in 1961. We had a lot of issues with social, political, and racial equality in this country at the time. And if you think about what policing was back then in the early 60s, you had multiple departments, multiple jurisdictions, but you didn't have any technology. There was no radio communication. There was no interagency cooperation. And most of the patrolmen had six-shooter revolvers. So as the decade got progressively more and more violent, we had JFK assassinated. We had, this was really the largest impetus was the Watt riots in 1965, which was a traffic stop that had happened just south of LA County in Watts, California. And they believed, the driver at the time believed he was being profiled, got out, it turned very confrontational, and before you know it, there was a massive riot. And they had to bring in the National Guard, and Watt PD had no idea how to handle the situation. So they kind of started to scratch their heads, and they said, all right, what do we need to do if something like this happens again? How do we handle this? Because our patrolmen can't handle it. We can't communicate between agencies, so what are we going to do? The following year, the Charles Whitman shooting happened. And then they started to realize, all right, the civilians, the citizens are going to war. They're getting trained on this machinery, this weaponry that's much greater than the six-shooter, and they're coming back with guerrilla tactics and they're employing them on us. So what do we do? How do we handle that? 1968, again, you saw two more assassinations, and then you saw what we saw, the first political influence on the development of SWAT. So we'll go to the next one real quick. All right, so to match the times, you began to see these departments responding in tow. So in '64, Philadelphia had an increase in bank robberies. So they said, well, how are we going to handle bank robberies? What we're going to do is we're going to have a 100-man unit. They're going to be on call 24 hours a day. Their job is only to respond to bank robberies. That way, when they get there, they can handle the bank robbery and only the bank robbery. In 1967, after the Watts riots, LAPD said, all right, we're going to have station defense teams. So that was basically the birth of SWAT, was these station defense teams. They said, we're going to put them at hard targets. So if we want to defend the Capitol, if we want to defend a memorial, we're going to put the LAPD guys there, and they're going to be this guerrilla unit, 15-man unit that just protects an area. It really didn't work out for them because there wasn't a tremendous amount of defense of an area that they needed. So in 1968, they created the Special Weapon and Attack Team. But LAPD brass says, well, attack is very violent sounding, and we don't like that. I think that means we're going to attack the citizens. We're going to attack the people in this country. So they changed it in '69 to Special Weapons and Tactics. And in December 8th, their first tactical deployment occurred, and it was actually a raid of a Black Panther warehouse. So it was 4 raids simultaneously went off, and it was quasi-successful, but it was also incredibly unsuccessful. So 4 high-risk warrants were issued. LAPD handled 2 of them. On one of them, it was an ambush. So they went in through the front door. The Black Panthers had put sandbags up and had put a 50-millimeter turret gun behind the sandbags. And as soon as the LAPD SWAT team opened the door, 3 of them were shot and put down. They survived, but at the time, they were only wearing flak jackets from the airplanes. They had no body armor. They had no lights on their rifles. So the Black Panthers were actually incredibly intelligent in that they put a giant spotlight in a dark room. So the minute they opened the door, they put the spotlight on. LAPD couldn't see, and then the machine gun opened up, and it put them down. So the only way that ended was, it was a funny story, was the Black Panthers were listening to LAPD's radio communications. So they could hear everything that was happening. And so every time LAPD tried to do something, the Black Panthers anticipated it. So finally, one of the guys in LAPD says, I think they're listening to our comms. Why don't we tell them we have tanks coming in and we're just going to blow the place up with tank missiles? So they put that out over the radio. The tanks are 5 minutes out. We're just going to level the place. As soon as they did, they came out, they surrendered. And 1969 was really kind of the defining point of, all right, we need to create a full-time team because this part-time thing isn't going to work. And in 1971, SWAT became a full-time division. Right after that, Detroit launched their own, which was known as the Stress Unit, which was also a full-time division in Detroit, which was another city that needed a lot of work. So the definition, the idea of SWAT was to provide protection, support, security, firepower, and rescue to police operations in high-risk situations where specialized tactics are necessary to minimize casualties. That's what SWAT was built for, all right? At the time, that was three things. It was crowd control, it was high-risk warrants, and it was sniper warfare, guerrilla warfare. So those three things SWAT was designed to be able to handle. Beyond that, they didn't really know, like, where is SWAT going to fit in? What is SWAT going to do? The 1970s, if you could hit it for me, these are some of the initial issues they came into. I left that here for a reason, and I'm going to come back to it, but let's just go to the next one real quick. All right, the 1970s, what a lot of people don't know is domestic terrorism was through the roof in this country. All right, so there were 480 incidents of domestic terrorism in 70 alone. I don't know if you guys remember the Patty Hearst incident, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. 920 over the next 9 years. We had another sniper in 1972, which was Mark Essex, and in 7 days he went on a rampage and killed 22 people. But they didn't have the capability to handle that because there were only a couple of different SWAT teams at that time. And in 1974, the SLA and Patty Hearst, again, was LAPD. Over that decade, officers were killed in the line of duty at a massive rate because they didn't have the resources or the technology to handle the higher caliber weaponry and the guerrilla tactics that were being used against them. So as soon as the SLA incident happened in 1974, for those who don't know, Patty Hearst was an heiress. She was kidnapped by the SLA. She became a member of the SLA. She was in a hideout with the SLA. LAPD got a tip that they knew where she was. They went to serve the warrant. The people in the house started firing at LAPD. LAPD fired back. It was fully televised. It was the first time SWAT was ever televised on television. They ended up throwing in gas. So they put gas into the house to try to smoke them out. The gas ignited a fire inside the house. It burned the house down. Instead of surrendering, the gunmen stayed in and shot out at the police. They ended up burning in the house and they ended up perishing. And it was all on national TV. So what that created was this phenomenon of SWAT. And the following year, 1975, SWAT was released in this country on television as a television show. And SWAT became the new sexy, right? Everybody wanted to talk about SWAT. Everybody loved SWAT. So there were, of course, that's a SWAT page. So, no, it's a test of the system, right? Okay. So there were a lot of issues, though, right? So SWAT, when it first came out, was not successful. And it wasn't successful because there was no planning, there was no development. It was, hey, you know what? I'm going to put you in charge because I really like you, and you pick your 5 buddies, and you guys go ahead and do what you got to do. There was no oversight. Nobody wanted to put their hands on it. Nobody wanted anything to do with it because it was really just a goon squad. They were using higher levels of force. They had no additional training. There was a lot of favoritism that happened, and then it began to elevate the amount of force they used on the citizens and therefore the amount of force citizens used on them. So it went up and up and up as far as more and more problems. And in 1971, there was a huge court case. It was called the Downs case. And what happened in the Downs case was the Supreme Court said, hey, look, if you're going to be a specialized unit, you must have specialized training. And we will hold you to a much higher standard than regular patrol. So you are civilly and criminally liable to a different standard of patrol. And as soon as that happened, and what that came out of was a helicopter had been hijacked, and crisis negotiators came in, and they didn't know what they were doing, because the CNT at the time was really still in its infancy. And so they just put 2 guys on the phone with these hijackers, and the hijackers ended up killing everybody on board and then crashing the plane. And the guys that were in CNT were like, well, I mean, we weren't really trained. We just did whatever. And they were like, well, you did everything wrong. And so you ended up costing the life of Downs by your actions and what you did. So once they became criminally and civilly liable, everything changed, right? Because now departments were like, whoa, we got to do something to make sure that doesn't happen to us. So the Downs case created a unity across the board as far as what the regulations were. So the NTOA, the National Tactical Officers Association, was born, and all of a sudden everything was regulated. The size of your team dictated the amount of calls you could handle. The size of your team dictated exactly what your standard procedures were, who you had to call, what you could do, and then the type of equipment you had, which is what you see out here, was dictated by the NTOA as well. You had to have this, you have to have this, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So if we can move on real quick. All right. So this led to the 80s. Now, all of a sudden, the 70s incredibly violent, the 60s incredibly violent, the 80s happened. And from 1972 to 1982, half of the country's specialized units were born. But from 82 to 96, the number doubled one more time. All right? And now you begin to see politicians get on board. And you saw Reagan come into play. All right? You saw LBJ, who was before Reagan. And they got in what was a Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act. And essentially, what that says was, we have a war on drugs. And now SWAT became a tool for war on drugs, which is probably the worst thing that could have ever happened to it. But it did. And as soon as that happened, the government said, hey, look, we're going to use police to do interdiction with the military at the lines of Mexico. And we're going to do interdiction with both using the Coast Guard and using military troops to prevent drugs from coming into this country. So you now had an intermingling of the law enforcement and the military, which became known as militarization, which we're going to talk a little bit about as well. So from 1980 to 1989, the deployments for SWAT teams quadrupled. And most of those, 80%, were for high-risk warrants for drugs. All right? And so now SWAT became inexorably tied to high-risk warrant and the war on drugs. If we can go to the next one real quick. All right. So this is the political factors we were talking about. So the Omnibus Crime Control and State Streets Act, this was LBJ in the turn of the century into Nixon right there. We had the Drug Abuse and Prevention Control Act, and then Ronald Reagan, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. So you can see all of a sudden they start landmarking money for these specialized teams. And they said, all right, we're going to give these teams all the money they need. Any department can create them. They can be centralized. They can be regional. Because what we have to do is we've got to fight drugs. And we're going to use these guys to do it because they're the best ones to do it. And you can see the amount of funding that went towards an increase on this war on drugs. And it just got larger and larger and larger. So departments started writing themselves checks. Right? They started saying, all right, well, hey, look, if the government's willing to give me $1 billion, I'll take $1 billion and I'll create a specialized team. The problem was they weren't paying attention to those specialized teams and what they were doing. So there was a lot of misuses of force. There was a lot of issues early on, right, through the 70s and 80s, where these teams were kind of doing what they needed to do, and they're using military equipment to do it. And that really peaked in the mid-90s under Clinton. So let's go to the next one real quick. All right, so as we come into the 90s, the National Defense Authorization Act, the Violent Crime Control of '94 was the largest criminal justice reform in this country at the time, all right, and that landmarked millions upon millions of dollars for these specialized teams. But the 1997 Hollywood shootout was probably one of the defining moments for LAPD SWAT, and most of the people in the room should remember that one. So what happened was you had two bank robbers in LA, and they were using assault rifles. And so patrol shows up, and they get there, and they say to themselves, how do we handle this? Like, what do? We got to call SWAT. So they called SWAT, and SWAT came in, and it was a motor vehicle pursuit. The SWAT team chased them down, and they ended up shooting the two shooters. But thousands of rounds were expended, all right? And it was all on television once again. And at that point, they said, all right, listen, we got to get patrol rifles to these guys. We got to make sure that they work with SWAT moving forward. We got to integrate patrol, and then we got to make sure that we take any excess military equipment, and this was the big one, take the excess military equipment and we give it to patrol. So any patrolman now, or any agency that wants excess military equipment, all you have to do is apply for a government fund and you can get it. So now you saw the Bearcats come into town, right? The armored tanks and the vehicles. You saw the long rifles come into town. You saw the body armor come into town. You saw all of this stuff. And that really was a result of the '97 Hollywood shootout. Columbine happens in 1999, and now all of a sudden active shooters are a new direction for SWAT teams, right? So historically, SWAT dealt with hostage rescue. Hostage rescue changed over the years, and what we saw in Columbine was that hostage rescue was the immediate termination of hostages, right? So in the past, it used to be, prior to Black September, if you remember that one as well, it would be you'd take a hostage, You would make demands, the police would come, SWAT would arrive, we would negotiate, we would try to render the safe rescue of the hostages, and then we would get the hostages out and handle the suspects. Columbine and Black September was, Black September was the first one where they executed the hostages before the police could get there. Columbine, they did the exact same thing. And they realized we have no idea what we're doing. We have to come up with a new plan. We have to handle active shooters. And we realized, hey, you know what? We can't really use SWAT for active shooter because SWAT takes too long to get there. And the threat is over in only a couple of minutes. So we have to teach patrol how to handle active shooters. And now you begin to see an integration of tactics between SWAT and patrol. All right, so that was the first learning curve where we had to begin to work together. Prior to that, it had been, oh, you have patrol and you have SWAT, and they're these two completely separate entities. And these guys are, twisted steel and something else. And the guys down here are just kind of peons that do patrol. 2001, the terrorist attacks. After that, it was carte blanche for specialized teams, right? The government said, hey, look, we need you guys to do whatever you want to do whenever you want to do it because terrorism is the key. Terrorism is a huge problem in this country. Whether we want to argue that terrorism was a huge problem in this country at the time or not is a totally different story. But you can see that once again, the checks are being written. And now excess military equipment was coming into these teams. Different tactics were coming into these teams. They were training with the military again. And so, you saw another explosion of these TAC units doing things that these TAC units hadn't done before. Next slide real quick. All right. So I just have this up here to kind of talk about militarization, because militarization has always been a hot topic with SWAT. So when you look at the Law Enforcement and Military Cooperation Act and the 1998 Act, where the excess military equipment was given to police departments that requested it. What's that?
Just saying anybody.
Yeah, correct, anybody, but really any department that wanted it. A lot of academics came out and said, we're seeing a militarization of the police, all right? And there was actually an act, and I'm completely blanking on it right now, and I'm incredibly upset with myself. That was the Posse Comitis, all right, which was a separation between police and military in the initial Constitution. A lot of critics felt like, hey, we have bled those two together, and there's no longer a separation. And so the argument became, well, what does militarization mean? Right? Is militarization the tactics they're using? Is militarization the dress that they wear? Is militarization the objective that they have? Or is militarization the culture within these organizations? What about SWAT is militarized? And that's still going on to this day, and that's something we deal with all the time. You'll still see it on the news. The SWAT team shows up, and they'll say, oh, an armed military unit with rifles got out of a armored vehicle or a tank, and they stormed a house. And there's a very blurred line. And sometimes it's very easy to say, hey, that's a military, that's not police. And sometimes it's very easy to say, hey, there's a large distinction there. So we're going to talk about why that came about and why some of these things that are really important to the operations actually is viewed as a militaristic. I think there's one more slide I have. Okay. So that brings us to Metro. So lo and behold, Metro-LEC happens, or what's known as North Star, which was this regional team that I'm going to talk about right now, happened in 1996. So right in the crux of it we talked about, 82 to 96, the amount of teams doubled, right? 96, there is a labor strike in Braintree, Massachusetts at a Kmart. So the chief gets together, he's got his lieutenants there, he says, I don't have the ability to handle this, we got to call in mutual aid. We got to call in all of the surrounding departments to help us. We don't have the manpower, we don't have the equipment, people are going to get hurt. Remember, the Watts riots, again, happened 40 years prior, but thousands of people got injured, hundreds of people died, and there was billions of dollars worth of damage. So they got nervous in Braintree. They said, all right, we got to handle this. They brought in all the units. The National Guard showed up, and then it lasted for a couple of weeks. So they said after that, how are we going to make sure this never happens again? So ironically, one of the lieutenants at the time says, hey, I tell you what, why don't we create a regional team? It's just going to handle crowd control, and then if the departments around us need something, we can respond to that as well. So he sent out an email. He said, hey, any departments interested in getting together, creating a kind of crowd control unit, and we'll kind of go from there. And there were crickets on the other line. I was like, I don't know if I want that. Because there's so much liability, if you think about that. All right, let's say I'm in Braintree and you're Milton, and you come to my town and use force. Who covers that financially, right? If something happens, that's the question. All right, so what about, if he gets injured? Who's going to cover him if he gets injured? Is it my department? Is it his department? Do you have a right of arrest in Braintree? Because right now he doesn't as a Milton officer. So now you got to come up with these mutual aid agreements. You've got to come up with these contracts for powers of arrest. So there's a lot of civil liability and litigation you've got to iron out. So finally, over the next year, year and a half, departments start coming on board. They say, man, we're getting huge spikes in crime. We got a lot of problems going on right now. Maybe we do need a regional response team. And so it was known as an RRT, a regional response team. In 1997, the team gets called out, this regional response team gets called out to a high-risk warrant. Okay, so the current PD can't handle it. He's an armed guy, he's in a house. Can you guys come and handle this for us? We don't know what we're doing. The RRT gets there and they say, well, we don't know what we're doing, so we can't handle it. Like, we appreciate the call, but we've never trained for that before. Like, that's not something we've ever done. We handle crowd control. So then they got together and they said, we got to do something. I mean, these agencies depend on us, right? So how do we put together a formal agreement? So North Star, all right, became Metro in 1998. All right, became a Metro community in 1998. And they expanded it's known as Metro Star, okay, Metro Star in 1998. And they expanded to 44 communities, all right? So it got smaller, which I'll talk about in a minute, but expanded to 44 communities, and it required a joiner's fee. So it said, hey, look, I'm going to let your community be a part of it. You pay $2,500, you join us, and we're going to bring you in, we're going to give you some basic equipment, we're going to train you up, and we're going to be able to handle high-risk warrants, we're going to be able to handle crowd control. So now we got those two things covered. Well, shortly thereafter, a kid goes missing, a young kid goes missing. And they're like, who do we have to search for this kid? And they're like, well, we could send the SWAT team in. And the SWAT team's like, well, we've never been trained on that. Like, if something happens to this kid, who's liable? Are we in trouble? Like, we don't know what we're doing, but we'll ground pound. So the SWAT team goes in, they spread out, they try to find the kid, unable to do so. They come back and they say, all right, we need to train for search and rescue. So now the SWAT team takes on search and rescue. So now they have three functions, right? So now you have high-risk warrant, crowd control, search and rescue. Well, a couple of years later, you got a hostage. Well, that's me, right? So the team heads to the hostage rescue, and he says, all right, well, we've got to handle this, right? So all of a sudden now hostage rescue becomes part of what this team does. So by 2002, Metro Star became Metro-LEC, and that was this communities came together and created a law enforcement council. All right, so STAR was Tactical Area Regional Response. All right, so it was 41 communities. Metro-LEC was 41 communities. It covered 700 square miles. I mean, that's a massive area, right? Massive area. The population was around 1 million between in that 700 square miles, and it was run by 50 officers, and they were going out about 36 times a year for one of those 4 different calls. All right. Now, one of the other reasons why they created this regional team was because previously, if something happened in a community, state police would come in. And, there's always been state police, local police, state police, local police. I mean, it's just like police and fire, right? There is a rivalry between the two. It's usually pretty friendly. But when the state comes in, they own the scene. They control the scene. So the chief loses complete power. So the chief of Needham would have no power if state police comes in and handles a crime scene, handles a hostage rescue, handles a high-risk warrant. It's owned by the state. And the chiefs were getting chafed by that because they were like, well, you're going to come into my town, use the force that you deem necessary, and then you're just going to leave me to clean it up. So they said, all right, when we structure this LEC, we're going to leave the chief in charge of the host agency. So if this SWAT team goes to Braintree, the chief of Braintree runs the SWAT team. No experience with it, has no idea what this team does or how we do it, but he's going to run the team. He's the ultimate commander. Now, we have commanders on our team that will go to him and say, hey, here's what we have. We could do this, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this. What would you like us to do? And they will advise. They'll be his consiglieres, and then he'll choose and say, all right, use gas, don't use gas, use this, don't use this. You can rake and break, you can't break the windows, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of brings us through 2002. After 2002, this team has grown and evolved substantially. All right, the equipment has changed drastically. What this team does has changed drastically. But the ultimate foundation of this team is still the same. It's still 50 members. It's now 44 communities. All right, it's just over 700 square miles. It's right around 1 million. And the state is broken up into 5 of us. So there are 5 LECs that cover the entire state now. And we go from Boston out to Quincy, down to Plymouth and below, and all the way to Weston. So we are a massive region, all right? It'll take us on a rush hour traffic without lights and sirens. It's 1 hour and 20 minutes to get to a call. Most of us have lights and sirens, so it's 1 hour to a call. It's not much of a difference, but it's a huge area, and we still get about 36 activations a year. I do search and rescue, so I'm a search and rescue manager for the team. And I'm also an operator on the team. I've been on the team for 5 years. And when you look at how this team has changed and how it's continuing to change, we really went from hey, we're here, we have a job to do, let's get it done, to we have to let the situation evolve. All right? We've slowed things down substantially. So before, if we had a barricade, the objective was, and again, this isn't always the best thing, but back in the day, you have 50 guys in your town, you're paying overtime for all 50 of them potentially. That's a lot of money. The clock's ticking. To have some guy drunk in his room or in his house just sitting there saying, I don't want to come out, chiefs are like, get him out of the house. Let's go. What are we doing right now? And we would go in and we would take him out, right? But now, and it's a good thing, but it's created what was known as officer-induced jeopardy. So let's say, Joe is sitting in his house drinking beer. He's got a knife next to him. He says, hey, I'm not coming out. I have a warrant, but I don't want to deal with it. Just go away. And we go in to get him. And he takes that knife and he lifts it up and then we shoot him. Right? We now have officer-induced jeopardy. If we hadn't entered that house, he would never have lifted the knife and we never would have had to shoot him. Right? So we created the situation where we had to kill Joe. And that's a huge problem. And so from a liability perspective, the court said, no, you got to stop it. And then our constituents said, no, you got to stop it. And our morals said, no, you got to stop it. So now, how do we get Joe out of that house? So we've had to look up other tactics. We've had to come up with other ideas. What are some possibilities? And there are less lethal options we can use. We can use a canine, which we've used, right? We can use the concept of gas, which is certainly far and above what it was back in the SLA days, all right? We can use less lethal rounds, less lethal munitions. And we can use CNT, right, crisis negotiators. So those guys are specially trained in how to talk to people and how to identify, what the factors are, what the triggers are for them, and then how to talk them off the ledge and get them out of the house without using force. Does it work every time? No. Does it work more times than not? Yes. There are times, unfortunately, that, on a barricade, that the subject will take their own life. That was their intent from the onset, and it's sad and it's tragic. But when we arrive at a barricade where someone is threatening their own life, our goal is to make sure that everyone around them is safe and then to try and save them. All right? That's the priority of life. We want to make sure that if you're her neighbor and she's committing suicide, that you're safe and you don't get hit with a firearm, and then we'll deal with whether or not she hurts herself. Okay? If you look at the 5 primary calls we have now, so we have barricades, which we just talked about. And there's 2 types of barricades. There's barricaded subject and there's barricaded suspect. So we use that differentiation to really talk about 2 different types of personalities. A suspect is, let's say, I just robbed a bank, I shot at a bunch of people, I ran into a house, I shut the door, I locked the door, and now I'm barricaded with a firearm. All right, you are a suspect. Right? You are a criminal who's in a house with a weapon and you're refusing to cooperate with law enforcement. A subject is a mentally ill person, the intoxicated person who just lost their house, just lost their significant other, just lost their child, who is now at a breakdown, at a low point in their life where they want to take their life and they're willing to take someone else's, right? We say suicidal is homicidal. If you're willing to take your own life, then what's another life in the grand scheme of things? So that's a subject. And we handle the 2 very differently, okay? We handle the 2 very differently in that a subject, we're going to make sure that we give them as much of the services that we have on hand at the time of that incident, right? We want to make sure that they know that we're there for them, to help them, and to get them help. They are not under arrest. All right? They are going to be Section 12. So it's a medical evaluation. A suspect is under arrest. All right? And I'm going to have Joe talk a little bit about what CNT does as soon as I tell you what the other 4 calls are that we respond to. Because he's really going to talk to you about how they talk to a suspect versus a subject and how we offer them the services. Hostage rescue, that's another primary call we have. We just had one this week. So if you saw it in the news, Holbrook, we had a gentleman who was a wanted criminal. They went to serve a warrant. He took his girlfriend hostage, refused to let her go, refused to come out, and we spent 5 hours with him negotiating. We finally got the secure release of the girl, and then he surrendered to us shortly thereafter. So that's a hostage rescue. I actually have a video of another hostage rescue that you guys will get to watch in a little bit. I don't have the video of the one from this week because it takes a little time to develop. Search and rescue. Obviously, we do a good amount of that, right? We search for kids that run away. We search for dementia patients that wander. We search for autistic and mentally disabled, intellectually disabled people that leave their homes. Those are all very common scenarios. So each one has a very different process. We basically, and I can talk a little bit more about that after Joe talks about CNT, and we have high-risk warrants. So high-risk warrants are either an arrest warrant for a known bad guy who has firearms or access to firearms. Yes, sometimes there are drug warrants. Yes, there are sometimes search warrants, but we handle all of them very differently. So I'm going to get into the warrant service after Joe talks about CNT, and I will be right back with you.
Alrighty, so my name's Joe Brienze. I've been on Needham PD for about 3 years. I came from Medfield PD where I did another 4. I'm also on Metro-LEC as well as on the crisis negotiation team. Been on that for almost 4 years. So basically what happens is kind of where we start is, say Needham gets a call, they get a call wherever, 120 Central Ave, there's a male party, female party, anyone. They're in an upstairs bedroom, they have a firearm, they don't want to live anymore. So they get on scene, they confirm that there is a party inside, they confirm if there's anybody else inside, they call our control chief who will decide whether SWAT and CNT is going to get activated for this. If they do, we get a page in our phone, we respond down. So while SWAT is setting up, they're kind of containing the house, making sure there's no one else inside. We're getting all the info on this subject. For a basic call out, meaning there's only really one subject or suspect in the house, you're looking at about 9 people that we need in order to respond just on the negotiation aspect. We have a team leader. It's Lieutenant Kelleher. He's from Canton PD. He works with SWAT as almost like a liaison, saying what we need. Are we able to make a phone call yet? He'll kind of guide us in where we want to go with this conversation. We have a primary. That's their sole job is negotiations. And unfortunately, we don't have the bus to show you, but basically they sit inside this room. They're kind of cornered against a wall, and nobody talks to them. They put headphones on. They connect their phone to this system, and they start trying to call the subject that's in crisis right now. That's all they do. No one's allowed to talk to them. If you want to pass notes, you have to go through the coach. So this basically allows the primary to focus strictly on the subject, because if we do get involved in this conversation, that subject or suspect wants to know that you're focusing on them. They don't want to be distracted by anyone else. They're clearly having an awful day. I mean, the reason most of the times we get called are people are in crisis. So they want to make sure that what they're telling them, it's all recorded, they're focused, and this is their only job. If you have any things you want to say to the primary, you pass little notes. It goes to the coach, and the coach is going to say, yes, I'm going to pass it to him, or no, and I'm just going to throw it away. We have a guy that does the sit board, which the best way to do it is kind of just write it over here. We divulge everything about somebody's life when we get on scene. Who the subject is, the significant events, why we are here. Did they lose their house? Did they lose their wife, their husband, something like that? Why are we here? Have they lost people in the past? Are they in credit card debt? Something like that. Hooks. What do they love? We go through their social media, their Facebook, their Instagram, their LinkedIn, their Twitter, you name it. We will find anything about you and what works. Do you like hunting? Do you like fishing? Do you like cars? Do you like to go to the movies? Do you love Cape Cod? Anything like that, we save that for hooks. And that's things that we'll use if the conversation starts to go dry or we're just trying to build rapport. Hey, what do you like to do in your spare time? I like to go to Cape Cod. Try and hint it to them, see if they'll bite it, and then, well, oh yeah, I love going to Cape Cod, and it distracts them from the crisis that they're in at that moment.
So who does that's research you're doing?
So,
The team and they pass it to the coach?
yep, so that's Intel and ISU. So at the minimum, we have 2 negotiators that their sole job is to go through their entire social media. They look if they have kids, they look at if they have grandparents that they love, dogs, cats, hamsters, it doesn't matter. We have 2 dedicated to ISU, which is another part of Metro. Just to not really go into it too much, but ISU basically is able to ping phones for us if we need to get warrants, things like that. They do that aspect for us, and we always send 2 negotiators with ISU. We'll be able to interview family members because most of the time they do show up on scene. Well, that's where we get these hooks. What do they love? What don't they love? Did they have a terrible upbringing? So which I'll get to, that's an avoid. We don't talk about their parents if something like that happened. But that's more of just getting a ton of background from them. Do they have weapons in the house? So we got called there for a firearm, so we make sure we have it there. Medical history. Have they suffered from mental health issues? Anything like that? Do they have cancer? Do they only have a few months to live? And this is why they finally have come to this part. Positives. Similar to hooks, just things that we've realized that have worked in their life. Did they recently get a promotion? Do they have a good support system? Stuff like that. Threats. So that would be they want to obviously take their own life. Criminal history. Have they ever been to jail before? And that also kind of goes into the ISU part of it, is when someone goes to jail, they have a BOP. It's called the Board of Probation. And in there, it's their parents' names and possibly where their place of birth. And that's how we can get more information. We can look up that address, see if the parents still live there, send an officer there to have a conversation with them. They may already know about it. They may be on their way. Do they have a good relationship? We can put their parents' names into hooks and positives and go from there. Avoids, like I said, do they have a dog that they love that died? We're going to avoid the dog. Did they have an awful upbringing? Were they in foster homes? Things like that. We avoid this, obviously, as much as we can. Victims, is anyone else inside? If they're just by themselves, there's no victims. We do a risk assessment. So on others, low, medium, and high. So does he have victims inside the house? Others is also considered the police. Does he want to go suicide by cop? That would escalate it to a medium or high. And then self, same thing, low, medium, and high. So he's suicidal, he's obviously high. And we pass that on to SWAT so they know that, hey, listen, after talking to him, we don't think he wants to do it himself. He wants to induce an officer-involved shooting. And that kind of changes their tactics going there. Then the last one is a TPI. It's a third-party intermittent. We try to avoid it as much as possible. It's basically having somebody else on the phone other than us. It never ends well, usually. There's a few things we avoid when talking to people. It's one, allowing them to write a note, because a note is usually an end game. They're saying their goodbyes. The note is their final thing. They're going to say goodbye to everyone, and that's it. We also try to avoid having other people talk on the phone. With that said, we may introduce a recorded message because we need to filter that conversation. You try to avoid things when you say, like, I know what you're going through. Because 99% of us, including us, we don't know what you're going through. We may have never lost our house. We may never have had a terrible upbringing. We may not have cancer. So we try to avoid things like that. So if we had a party who we couldn't really, for lack of a better term, control on the phone, and they say, I know what you're going through, you don't know what they're going through. And that sets a lot of people off. So we try to avoid having people talk directly to the phone. In some instances, we had Hingham earlier this year. We were talking to the suspect. The suspect was talking to his girlfriend, and the girlfriend was talking to the mother. And it was a four-way conversation with us. There's nothing we could have done about it. He just linked in other phones, and it was a scream fest on the phone, and it was a disaster. Thankfully, the suspect did come out, but that's why we try to avoid having someone talk directly to that person. So that SIP board timeline is just basically we write down when we started making phone calls. Do we do text messages? What are the text messages? It's just so if, God forbid, this ever went to court, well, how much did you guys really try? And on an average call, if they're not answering, we call 75 times. We'll probably send 50 text messages. Eventually, they will most likely turn their phone on. Even if it's off, you just keep going. Because eventually they're going to turn their phone on for that second, and you're trying to grab that ring so they answer it. Intel ISU I already talked about. And then this is kind of what we've gone to in the last couple of years is negotiators going downrange. So there's usually two of us that go downrange with SWAT. And instead of just sitting behind a phone, we try and go up to either a door in an apartment or in a house, or we hail from a PA system or a bullhorn. And it makes it a little more personal to the person. They hear somebody on the other end. It's not just a phone where you could be 3 miles away. You're right there with them. A lot of times they don't want to answer their phone, so it works a lot better to go face-to-face. The one in Holbrook, neither party wanted to have their phone on for the first 3 or 4 hours, so we were able to have a couple negotiators go down range, go to the second floor with SWAT, and use a bullhorn at the window, and the suspect came to the window. And we had a conversation with the suspect. He was willing to release the female party, his girlfriend, and after a few minutes, he also himself came out, and everyone got to go home that day. Yeah, I feel like that's...
We talked about barricades. When we talk about a subject versus a suspect, let me ask you your personal opinion. And this is a tough conversation, but do you think law enforcement is legally obligated to prevent someone from committing suicide? See, it's a good question. Yes is the right answer, no is the right answer. I mean, there is a correct answer, but they're all good answers because it gets you thinking. What do you guys think on this side of the room? And let me say this, right? Now, I'm going to throw a loop in it. We use the word legally. Right? Is it legally obligated or are we morally obligated? What do you guys think? Well, okay. So I think, you know, the correct answer by the court standard is we are not legally obligated, right? We cannot be held accountable or expected to be held accountable for going into your house and stopping you from killing yourself. Because if you have a knife and we go in to stop you and you kill yourself, did we create the jeopardy? Did we create you killing yourself? If you go in and you use suicide by cop and you come at us and now we have to shoot and kill you, was that a suicide technique? Did you try to kill yourself by letting us kill you? So the courts have said you're not legally. Morally, well, we certainly want to. We want to prevent you from hurting yourself. Right? That's our guiding compass for all of us. So I would like to think that morally we feel obligated to stop. If I get a call of a suicidal person, I'm probably not going to drive slowly there. Right? I'm going to go quick. I want to get there. I want to get out. I want to try to engage, and I want to stop that. Just like if I had someone in cardiac arrest, I wouldn't drive slowly. So, you know, the courts have really kind of wavered on that. Now, that's for barricades. Let's talk about the use of a SWAT team. Is that a use of force? Right? We talk about, all right, defensive tactics is a use of force. Pepper spray is a use of force. Taser is a use of force. Your firearm, drawing it, is a use of force. Is the physical activation of a SWAT team a use of force? What do you think? We got one yes. You say yes? What do you guys think on this side? That's a tough one, right? Yeah, yeah. These aren't easy questions, and the Supreme Court has had to deliberate on these for years. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that it is a use of force, and therefore the use of a SWAT team must be constitutionally justifiable by the totality of the circumstances and the events leading up to their activation. So if I have a barricade and I am in my room by myself and I say, hey, I'm going to take some pills and I'm going to overdose, and a chief decides to send a SWAT team into my room, that is not constitutionally justifiable. I posed no imminent threat to anyone other than myself. I had no immediate means. I made no immediate threats. I did not say I was going to harm anyone. I don't have a weapon in front of me. You break my windows, you kick my door in, you come into my house, we have a problem. Okay? Now, change the same scenario. Guy's got a gun, says I'm going to kill myself and anybody who's in this room. Now you have a justifiable use for a SWAT team. So we come to high-risk warrants. What is a high-risk warrant? I mean, that is a subjective statement, right? Like anything could be high risk. The courts have said, well, no, high risk is based on the location, the weaponry, the time of day, the previous history, the threats made, all right? So high risk is, again, a totality of circumstances. Now, there's three types of high-risk warrants, all right? There's low profile. There is arrest, and there is search. And search is broken down into two things: drugs and firearms. Okay? So the use of the team will change across this spectrum. Each one of these is a different risk category. Right? Historically, a low-profile hit is, hey, he is a higher risk than patrol can handle. He may have a history of firearms, although we don't know if one's there. We cannot justify activating the full SWAT team, but we can justify activating a small number of the SWAT team. And we would also say that the show of force, the coercive force that a SWAT team represents just by showing up in uniform with this weaponry, we cannot justify it with this hit. But we can use the bodies, we can use low-profile armor, and we can use your firearm, right? That is not coercive force to this extent. This is highly coercive. You see this in your front yard, you're probably cooperating. You see this in your front yard, you might say, maybe, maybe not. Okay? That's a low-profile hit. An arrest warrant, relatively simple, right? You say, all right, well, bad guy in a house, he's under arrest, we got to get him. How we handled that 10 years ago is completely different from how we handle that now. And how we handled that 20 years ago is probably what gave these teams such a bad reputation. All right? And it wasn't that they didn't know better. It's not that they knew better. It's that they so new. It was still a novel idea. So what we used to do is we used to go in and get the guy, right? But think about how much jeopardy you're putting the team in and the individual in to get a guy. Well, you know where he is. He's not going anywhere, right? So the tactics change from what's known as a dynamic entry to a surround and call out. So dynamic entry, we kick the door in and we go in. Surround and call out, we call them out. The courts have said, well, there's two different ways to kick the door in and get them. Okay? There's a knock and announce. And there's a no-knock. Everybody, especially in the media, knows about the no-knock, right? No-knock is you go in at 4 o'clock in the morning, everyone's out cold, sound asleep, kick the door in, you drop the flashbang. Wake up, we're here, all right? High level of constitutional force. I mean, you have to have a ton of reason for that. The knock and announce is a little bit of a lower threshold. Please search warrant, please search warrant, please search warrant. You see it on all the cop shows, right? Like, you guys in blue, the FBI, the federal agents, please search warrant, please search warrant. You got to give them a reasonable amount of time to get to the door. Once they do, you enter the house and you go in. They used to use these for arrest warrants. They don't anymore, okay? They don't because, again, You're not looking for anything. He's not destroying anything. You're just there to get him. He can come out to you now. Okay, so that tactic has changed drastically. So then it comes to the search warrant. And this is really the crux of, right, the dynamic entry, is the drugs. And that's what happened with the war on drugs we talked about. And that's how we got inexorably tied to search warrants for drugs. The argument is, all right, if we go in there quick, and we kick that door in, and we drop bangs, and we disorient them, all right, we overwhelm them with the superiority of force, it's safer for us, and it's safer for them. Right? That's the logic. That's the idea. They can't destroy the product, and now we get them. We don't have enough without the product, therefore we need it. Well, it's become a highly contentious point of debate within academics. Is it an abuse of power? Is it constitutionally justifiable? And is it socioeconomically and racially skewed in how the application of force for drug warrants occurs? And that has been a huge topic through the late 90s and into the 2000s of, well, where are they doing these no-knocks and these search warrants for drugs? Poor neighborhoods, ethnically diverse neighborhoods, and therefore, if you look at the statistics, it would appear that the no-knock warrants and the drug warrants are skewed between populations, right? And so that's problematic, obviously. All right, so we get into hostage rescue. Hostage rescue is probably the least common of what we do, right? It's not every day that someone takes a hostage and says, hey, if I don't get a pizza, from downtown Boston, I'm going to execute the hostage, right? So we don't see it a ton, but we see it a couple times a year. Lately, it's been more and more frequent, all right? Our tactics on hostage rescue are twofold, and again, I really can't talk a ton about it, but when we initially arrive, we have to look at our priority of life, all right? And our priority of life is known as HIPS. All right. So this is our code, especially on hostage rescue. So hostages, number one priority of life. All right. So that is our primary goal, is to rescue the hostage. Innocents. That's the neighbors, the people downstairs, the people in the rooms around them. Okay. Police. That's us. So their lives come well before us. And then the suspect. All right? And that is what drives us in a hostage rescue. Now, how we get there, what we do, there's a couple different ways we go about it. All right? Usually, the first guys on scene are going to be an emergency response team. All right? They will drive to the hostage to save the hostage's life if need be. Other than that, they're going to wait for the resources to arrive. Remember, up until Black September, we didn't see the execution of hostages specifically for the purpose of terrorism. Right? That was the first true terrorist attack, in that they killed hostages in order to create fear. And then again, we saw it with this concept of an active shooter. It's terrorism, all right? But most hostage rescue, the hostage is alive, the hostage is okay, and now we have to negotiate and try to get the hostage out of there. I'm going to show you a video of hostage rescue. I got at least one of them on the TV, on the video, all right? And then the two other minor functions that we do, crowd control and search and rescue. Now, I say minor because they're a little bit different. Crowd control, we go into the city of Boston anytime there's a riot, anytime there's a World Championship parade. We're just there in case. We're going to be in Plymouth this weekend. Obviously, it's the Plymouth parade. I think this is next year is the 200th anniversary, 300th anniversary. It's like the big one. I think it might be next year. But so we'll be there for that, right? So you'll see, we'll have snipers out. They're just watching for suspicious packages. They're watching for suspicious people. You'll have us out. We usually patrol in what we call a gun car. So there'll be a couple SWAT guys driving the route, making sure that no one's planting bombs. We got EOD out there. They're sniffing for packages. Essentially, what we did for the marathon, both before and after it. And then we have search and rescue. I love search and rescue. A lot of times it's sad. It's sad endings to search and rescue. You see a lot of innocent people who don't survive the elements in New England. Anytime you're dealing with seniors, Alzheimer's, dementia, intellectual disability, they tend to move towards water. And by the time we get there, We mobilize, we set up, we're looking for high probability of success, we're looking for the higher danger areas. It's all computer automated now, so we use computer systems. Everybody who searches runs GPS on their phone, so we can track the grid, see where we searched, see where we've looked. We run drones now, we run dogs, we run bike patrol, we run motorcycles. I mean, the resources we have for search and rescue are huge, and we have a good amount of activations for them. So, you know, they're tragic sometimes, they're successful other times. If somebody says, hey, I'm going to go in the woods and take my life, we got to go in and find them, right? That's our job. We want to get there before the family gets there. So we go out first to make sure we try to find them before family goes into the woods and finds their loved ones. So search and rescue is, you know, it's a heartbreaking job, but it's an incredibly important job for the team. So those are the 5 things that we do. The process takes about a year to get on. You have a tryout. You have a firearms tryout. You have to shoot high proficiency in the firearms. Then you've got a PT tryout. You've got to pass 3 physical fitness tests. And then you have what's known as assessment center, which is an interview board. It's an 8-hour-long interview. It's you with 50 guys in a room, 3 in front of you, 47 behind, and they just hammer you with questions. There is no right answer. Everything you say is wrong, but they want to see how you handle stress. Are you going to snap? Are you going to be short? Are you going to be able to handle it in stride? Are you going to be able to engage in conversation? Are you going to lie? Are you going to tell the truth? And they're going to ask questions they already know the answers to. Right? They're going to ask questions that they're going to try and jam you up with, not because they want to see you fired, but because they want to know, who is this guy? We don't know him. He's going to join our team. We want to make sure that he's of the same mindset, right? Team first. So after the year, every 6 months, we have to do a PT assessment, and we have to do a firearms assessment. If we fail either of them, and by failing a firearms assessment, it means I miss 1 round. If I miss 1 round, I am benched for a month. If I miss it again, I am benched for 6 months. If I miss it again, I'm off the team. All right? So that's it. Like, there is no room for a failure to train standard. Right? If you do not train to the standards of the team, you are not on the team. Very rigorous standards for both PT and for firearms. So this is the kit. All right? This is ballistic body armor. It has shrapnel armor as well. We've had a lot of debates about, hey, you know, do we need the shrapnel armor? About 18 months ago, one of the guys, we were at a call out, a guy shot out the door, hit the Bearcat, and the bullet lodged right here. So we were like, yep, we're wearing shrapnel protection. So I'll let you pick that up if you want, pass it around. That's about 30 pounds. This is about another 15 to 18 pounds. This is the rig we wear around our waist. That's probably about another 10 pounds. This is another 5 pounds. And then we get the rest of the kit. So all in all, you're coming in at about 50 for a baseline, maybe a little bit more than that. And then if you have any breacher gear on top of that, you're adding another 50 pounds to that. So you're carrying anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds going through the door. And it gets pretty heavy. All right? That's the helmet, Kevlar helmet. Right? They're getting better. They're definitely getting better. And then these are training rounds. So I brought these so you can kind of see. This is called force-on-force training. So we can't use our firearms in training, but it's kind of silly to point blanks at each other and say, oh, bang, bang, you're dead. So we wear full face masks, not the gas masks, but we do carry gas masks. Could we use them? But we use these. These are called simunition rounds. Right? They will not fire in the rifle. They're not live rounds. They won't hurt, or, well, they may hurt a little bit, but they won't kill anybody. They just will sting. All right? They're filled with paint. So the tip is paint. That's a colored paint. That is a clear paint. That's a pistol simunition round. And this is a simunition blank. So this just creates the bang, bang noise if we're trying to drive a target on a training towards, hey, there's a shooter in the other room, bang, bang. So we use that. They are full metal casings, right? So they work in a rifle. It uses a different bolt known as a sim bolt. So we switch the bolt out back and forth. They will not fire in this current gun because it isn't a sim bolt in there. When that comes at you, it comes at you really fast and really hard. It will break skin, right? So it creates that fear stimuli for us, right? So, you know, you'll see auditory exclusion with it. You know, you'll see some of those fear stimuli that are part of training and integral to training. So we use them for that purpose. We have to wear full protection. If we don't, they can be lethal rounds, right? If it goes into the eye, you're in a lot of trouble. If it goes into the neck, you're in a lot of trouble. So we use flashbangs, NFDDs. This is what it looks like. This is a training one. This at one time was a live NFDD that was deployed. and then was retaped up and painted blue to be a training bag. So this is the weight, this is the feel of it. This is actually an NFDD. We just use them. Well, so we never throw, all right? We always release into the threshold of the door, and that kind of gets into that litigation I was talking about. So I know we're running short here, but the reason why we don't throw when we put it in the sweep of the door is we used to just throw them into houses, right? We just drop them in. Well, they can create fires. That's number one. Number two, bad guys started to know that we were throwing them in there. And bad guys aren't good people, so they started putting their children's beds up against the windows and up against the doors. So cops were throwing them in, and they were exploding on their kids. And one child was maimed by one because they put a crib up against the door. And the cop opened the door, threw it behind the door, expecting it to be. The crib was behind the door with the baby. The bang went off, and the baby was disfigured, and they sued. And then the court said, hey, you need to have a sighted delivery of that. You can't just throw them into the house. So now they must be deployed with an sighted delivery and what we call the sweep of the door. So we never throw them, we always drop them. On the poles, it's on the outside of the house. We can see it. It's a sighted delivery.
Oh, so it explodes on the outside?
On the outside, it doesn't go into the house. We don't.
But it still delivers enough of a disruption?
Correct. It's basically a distraction, right? So get his attention there, and we enter here. These are night vision goggles. This is a monocular. We wear this on the top of the helmet. It clips in. This cord ties to the helmet. And then what we'll do is we'll snap that down into place, and it'll allow us to do night operations. So I don't know if anybody's ever had night vision or seen night vision. I just figured I would share that with you. This plugs into the body. On the body, there is the comm system. It plugs in right here. And then I can actuate that and communicate with the team. The team talks to me through the ear, and we go from there. So that's how we really talk to each other.
So is that on a radio?
Yeah, so the radio will go right in this pocket right here. We run a separate radio for Metro, so I don't have it in there right now. This is everything I carry on me. You know, and people say, oh, is it too much? You know, like, do you need that stuff? But our objective is to keep as many people safe as possible. And if that tool does it, then that's the tool I want. You know, it's not about having toys. It's really just about how do I keep my team and everyone else safe.
These guys have a really hard job. They're on call 24/7. They literally go at a minute's notice, and I really appreciate everything they do. Like I said, they've seen some crazy stuff. I talked about one class, the stuff we take home that I'm sure these guys wouldn't never even share. But they've seen a lot. They do a lot, and it's an important role they do and what they bring back to each one of us, the officers and the command staff. But being the first Citizens Academy we've done in my recent memory, I really appreciate your support and attending every week. And I know the chief wishes he could have been here, and fortunately North Hill kind of took him from us. But I can't thank you enough. I think this dialogue is really important, and it's been nice to share it because I love what I do, and I think this has kind of revitalized. It's been a tough couple of years for a lot of us, and it makes you think differently about the job. And this has helped me kind of reboost my positivity. So I want to thank you because a lot of stuff's going on in law enforcement. So it's nice to be able here and share this and with different-minded people, and I really appreciate it. So thank you very much. That will do today's episode and also our last episode of the Citizens Academy series. We hope through the past few months you've gained a better understanding of how local law enforcement operates, its collaboration with community partners and regional agencies. If you missed our previous episodes, they are available on demand on needhamchannel.org and the Needham Channel's YouTube channel. I'm Lieutenant John McGrath. Thank you for watching.